entrepreneurship among women in a formal forum. Seems to me, as a business historian, that it's a serious hole in the literature about economic functionality. So I'm very, very pleased to be here and have a chance to talk to you about my research a little bit. First, I'm going to try to do this very briefly so that we have more time for questions and answers than for me going blah, blah, blah. But it's important to understand how it is I came to study this material and to study it the way that I do. When I first became interested in Japan, when I first started taking coursework in Japan at university, it was common knowledge or common wisdom or kind of the basic discourse of the lives of Japanese women that they're good wives and wise mothers. That is, that they are homemakers, homekeepers, child-centered, right? And family-centered. And that was their role is limited to that traditionally, this expression, traditionally. Except when I went to Japan, I didn't see any. Maybe they were in their homes drinking tea or something. I didn't see any. That is, when I walked down the streets and went to the meat vendor to buy some food, it's a woman with a baby on her back, right? When I go to the retail store because I need to buy socks because I have a hole in my socks, it's a woman who's selling these socks, right? And I couldn't understand this kind of gap between what was being described and what was my visual, physical experience of being in Japan, right? So that began my attempt to get inside of what was going on among women in Japan and to try to look beneath what, at the time, I thought of as kind of a Western interpretation of Japan, and what I later came to understand as Japan's self-representation, right? That is, Japanese people will say, you know, women do X, women do Y, and the person who's saying it is doing something else. And, you know, try to understand, well, what's happening with that? So that's part of what started me in this direction. Studying entrepreneurship and studying entrepreneurship in Japan has some difficulties tied to it that may not obtain in other countries, and it has to do with the idea of ownership. I just want to lay this out for you. The idea in the West is that entrepreneurship is something that an individual does, and an individual can say, "This is my business." Grammatically, you can't say this in Japanese and not sound like a 2-year-old. Okay? Anything is the family's business. Uchi no kaiwa, uchi no this, our family's thing. If you say it's my thing, it sounds like, you know, mine, like a kid with a toy. So businesses and entrepreneurs, linguistically and in a lot of ways in terms of people's practical experience of it, is not an individual activity. It is a kind of corporate activity, and you can use the word corporate and interpret that in a number of ways. So I want to make sure that when I'm talking about entrepreneurship, if I talk about business women who, for example, are conjugal partners, okay, that is, you know, her husband and both of them are operating the business, I do not mean that it's the husband's business and she's some sort of, what? Helper, right? Just doing the dishes in the back or something, okay? That is, you don't say it's my business. Or for that matter, if it's a woman who started the business and is running the business, she may or may not say it's my business. She'll always talk about it as uchi no kaisha, okay? A family's thing, okay? So that makes an issue of definition in the term entrepreneurship of something worth querying. When you use this kind of Western expression and you're using it in the non-Western context where the notion of the individual is not necessarily understandable. Also, you might want to query it in terms of the United States or in the West, that we have a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? We kind of have a meta-narrative that individuality is a real thing, but I actually don't think I can think of any American entrepreneurs who actually do anything by themselves. So both of this idea of entrepreneurship and individuality, I think, is suspect. And so I wanted to preface my talk about this in terms of a problem studying entrepreneurship in Japan. And so here it is, the concept of ownership in Japanese cultural context makes the idea of entrepreneurship somewhat slippery. And I also, kind of an extension on this is the problem of decision-making in Japan. Decision-making is not something that happens from a top-down perspective often. And that corporate decision-making, again using that word in any number of ways, is common. So to say that an individual owns a business and is the decision maker is, well, it's almost a nonsense statement. Look at that, my formatting is funky. A and A. I apologize. Let's see. All right. Here I've already alluded to this also in terms of the problem of studying entrepreneurship in Japan, especially among women, okay? That is that if a woman's normative role and normative definition of herself, her identity, is tied to family, is tied to household, she will not self-report, either statistically or in any other kind of way, herself as a businesswoman, right? Which means that locating them in the historical record is extremely tricky. Right? So rather than looking, it's not like you can find some sort of indices somewhere, some index, about women entrepreneurs. What you're going to find is that when you're reading people's diaries, when you're reading people's journals, when you're reading this kind of material, you can only read between the lines to find evidence of women's economic productivity, their role of production in a family. Because what they're going to do is talk about, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, all this other kind of stuff. So there's a lot of reading between the lines that's necessary when you're trying to study this material. Okay? So it's a problematic topic. And those problems forced me to build the kind of research method that I use as a historian. So I'm a historian, but I use a lot of sociological or anthropological research techniques. So I have done a very large-scale survey of women entrepreneurs in Fukuoka Prefecture, which is my research site, where I sent out almost 6,000 surveys to women business owners. And so if you think there are not a lot of women business owners, 6,000 is a lot. And the return rate was around 17%, so I have a database of almost 900 women entrepreneurs or business owners of various sorts that I have data on, but I had to use this kind of questionnaire to access what they're thinking, what their experiences are, and then I had to use interview techniques to find out the experiences of the generation that came before them, because that generation doesn't exist in the historical record. And their lack of presence in the historical record is part of what makes people believe that there's no such thing as Japanese women entrepreneurs. It's part of this invisibility issue that goes on. So I use some sociological methods, I use some anthropological methods, and so today I hope I can integrate some information from some case studies, though I try to do an overview. Now I say this here, the first Japanese women entrepreneurs in quotes, because this is a generation of people who believe themselves to be the first entrepreneurs. Okay? They are not. All right? But the history of women's economic activities and economic power is so erased that Japanese women believe in this time period that they're the first, that they're the path breakers. All right? The most basic demographic that I can say about these people is that they come from the middle class and that they are housewives, or they were housewives. Okay? In the 1980s, the first generation of people who began to become activists, to talk about women's economic behavior, to become visible entrepreneurs. These are people that you'd see in the newspapers and in journals. Were women who had fully satisfied society's normative requirements of womanhood, that is to marry, to have children, to raise the children successfully. After that, they became entrepreneurs. After that, they could legitimately move into a more public space, more public role. Okay? When I say that they are middle class, I put this in quotes because class is a very complicated issue in Japan. You cannot talk about class the way you would talk about it, for example, with E.P. Thompson or some sort of Marxist or class as we would understand it, say, in a Western context. When I talk about class in Japan, and when I'm talking about the middle class, this is very, very loose. These are people who are supported for the most part by white-collar labor. And if you go back into their family history, are people who have normatively believed that women are tied to the household for a very, very long time. There are classes of women who do not come from this kind of normative belief system. We'll talk about that presently. So, these very, very early entrepreneurs, who are not really all that early entrepreneurs, early in the 1980s, are people who were tied to a business system through their husbands, satisfied these kind of normative roles, and then were able to utilize connections with their husbands, connections with their husbands' business connections, and quite frankly, a very high degree of education to start businesses in various sorts of consulting, a range of different kinds of businesses. this generation of women, 1980s, who satisfied the standards of what a woman should be, and then as mature women got into the business world, are responsible for, right now, grooming the next generation of business women entrepreneurs who are unmarried. Okay, so you've got this kind of apprenticeship system that's emerged in the 1990s, late 1990s, where a generation of norm-satisfying women are grooming and training a generation of women who have not yet satisfied the public norm, or in a position of not necessarily having to, I don't know, they may choose not to get married. And we'll look at the specific institutional mechanisms for that in a minute. Now, we've actually talked a lot about these already, and so I feel like we can probably go over this pretty quickly. This generation of women in the 1980s experienced certain institutional hurdles to entrepreneurship that one should not be surprised to encounter: normative gender roles, and these entrepreneurs got around normative gender roles which limit women's lives to the household by satisfying them. There's an expression in Japanese, as you age, you become a man. Women, as they get older, they become a man. Okay, that is, you can behave in the public sphere. You have more power, and it makes sense in kind of a Confucian gerontocratic system that as you age, you get more power, you get more authority, and that allows you to behave in ways that when you're younger you could not behave in. So that's how they leap this hurdle, by waiting until they've satisfied the gender norm. Here's another institutional hurdle of middle-class women's entrepreneurship, and that is the emergence of a truly nuclear family. That is, the family being, at least in terms of where it's living and how it's living, a husband and a wife and children. And the kind of splintering or moving away from a larger extended family where multiple people would have been involved in childcare. Multiple people. So when you have a changing family structure, independent business activity becomes increasingly difficult. Okay? So again, how you get around this is that you don't start your business until after your kids no longer require you. Right? Access to capital. We've already talked about this. Women report in the 1980s that when they were looking to get loans, they could not get loans. Or if they wanted loans, they needed to have a co-signer from a husband or a male relative. Or well, any number of other kinds of blockages that I think anyone in say, the United States experienced. Oh, I don't know. My mother experienced these kind of blockages in the 1960s. She couldn't get a loan without a husband's co-signature or something like that. So access to capital from formal institutions is something they had a very, very difficult time accessing. And so what they did, of course, and actually most businesses do that even in the United States, is they get capital from family. Right? They borrow money from their grandpa, they borrow money from their mother, they borrow money from various sources, and that's how they're managing to get enough startup capital to start a business. Okay? I'm being very, very brief about this, but there are some institutional solutions that they were responsible for supporting. Let's look and see how I've organized this. Okay? One of the ways that capital access problems were solved was because of the institution of equal heir inheritance law, which actually has been talked about immediately following World War II and during the occupation. Okay? What happens with equal inheritance law, and it has been mentioned, is that because there's a tradition of single heir inheritance, then women in a family who have legally in the 1950s, after the 1950s, had the right to inherit property end up selling the property to the eldest member of the family or to whatever designated heir in the family wants to continue owning that property or is being told you must continue owning that property. Okay? Which means that women who sold that property or that right to another sibling had a little cash loan. Okay? And some of my informants talked about using that little piece of money after their parents died to help fund their business. Okay? So they had access to a piece of money that they otherwise would not have had access to. The idea of land value, and as land value skyrocketed post-1970s, 80s, and 90s, the value of pieces of land that then you sold became bigger. And not to mention, people who inherited land, because the taxation on land inheritance was so very, very high, people don't want to own land anymore. When their parents die, they're like, oh, we have to pay huge taxes for this, so they want to get rid of it, so they sell it. So you had, in the 1970s, 1980s, people getting access to capital that they otherwise would not have had, and capital in sufficient quantities to use as startup capital. So these are one of the kind of solutions. Now, I'm talking about this group of people, these early 1980s business owners, who became activists because they went to the bank and they couldn't get a loan. Okay? They wanted to do something and no one would allow them to do it, or they had trouble getting clients, or any kind of these kind of gender things that they're bumping into pushed them into a kind of activism that allowed them to establish some new kinds of institutions to groom or to support or to train women and to, kind of like a network of women business owners. And the Women's World Bank Japan is one. It was established in 1986. And it is tied to the World Bank and has to do with the kind of microloans that were used in other Asian countries to give women access to small amounts of capital, small loans. So you have that appear in 1986, and the women who were tied to operating Women's World Bank Japan established things like seminars and kind of workshops and advertised them so that women who were interested in starting businesses had the beginnings of some sort of a community to try to get support and to access and to learn how to do that. So you have in the 80s this kind of an emergence, this generation of women who satisfied the norm, now beginning to establish certain kinds of institutions to subvert the norm, let's say, in the following generation. And as a result of that activism, you have the emergence of actual state support for female entrepreneurship. I'd say that it maybe got to its biggest in that International Year of the Woman, 1995, 96, where you have the state actually putting aside funds to support small and medium-sized business startup and having training, seminars and things like that that's actually funded by the government. Okay, so you did have this kind of thing. Interestingly enough, though, and it was alluded to, there are interesting constraints on who can attend these kinds of functions, okay, and what kinds of businesses are going to be supported by government loans. Right? I asked a government loan officer about this. I know a woman in my survey who grows persimmons, and she wants to add new stock to her persimmon farm. Well, the government loaned her money to expand her business and add a new range of stock of persimmon trees. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay, but they would, loan someone money to start a baby care center, right? Child care center, right? So there's some pressure and some limitations on what the government is willing to support in terms of women's businesses. So I want to point out that there is a kind of dream world in which middle-class women entrepreneurs believe themselves to be the first entrepreneurs, okay? And that they have a sense of having a stake in this system, having built new institutions, being on the cutting edge of creating a new gender norm, new opportunities for women, which is actually quite not supported in the historical record. Okay. So I'm going to write it this way: the first Japanese women entrepreneurs, without quotes, and tell you that this is a very, as I mentioned before, a very old thing, and I can't think of any society that has a market economy that does not have women engaged in market activities in one form or another. Even in societies where women are engaged in strict purdah, that is, they bound to the home. In cases of they use their children to do the market activities. So I mean, it's very, very odd to have countries where there are poor people, where women stay home and are full-time housewives. It's not sustainable in terms of human life, right? So working-class Japanese women have been engaged in work since, who knows, forever. Okay, I need to say, who do I mean when I say working-class Japanese women? This is complicated because in Japan, you go there and you ask people, what class are you? Everybody's middle class. Everybody's middle class. And visually, it seems like everybody's middle class for the most part because the Second World War burnt everything down for everybody. Right? So everybody became universally poor following the Second World War. But the values and the norms for people of different laboring categories prior to the war don't get burned up so easily, right? So, if you come from a class of people for whom, let's see if I have a son here, because I'm thinking in my mind, okay. If you have in your family background a gender norm and a working class norm that women must be and should be productive as compared to reproductive members of the family, okay, that value does not get burnt up by the Second World War, and it continues, okay? The idea that the state could impose a unified gender norm on Japan and say that all Japanese women are good wives and wise mothers, and all of them serve the state by raising healthy children who are educated. If you didn't come from that class, then that absorbing that idea, you know, it's a very slow process, right? And only very, very recently, 1960s, did it become well entrenched in the minds of large portions of the Japanese population. So, World War II and the stability of working class cultural forms. I want you to understand that the Second World War erased the visibility of a very heterogeneous class system, but it didn't erase the class system's values in individual families. Okay? And here's a great example. Okay? So you hear people saying wives should be good wives and wise mothers, but there's another expression that Japanese people use in the working class, okay, about what happens when you marry. Okay? When you marry and you move into your husband's household, you don't want to eat a stranger's rice. If you don't work, if you're not producing and being a productive member of the family, then you're eating somebody else's food. And it's intolerable to you not to be a productive member of society. And guess what? If you marry and you believe you shouldn't work, and you just want to be a good wife, wise mother, your mother-in-law is going to torment you, right? How dare you? Does it taste good to eat a stranger's rice? Right? So there's a different role that women are expected to play in different segments of the Japanese population that often is overlooked. Okay? So eating a stranger's rice. Among working class women, women are expected to be productive and not merely reproductive. Well, I'm going to run over 30 minutes, aren't I? I'll try not to. Okay? In the working class, one should not be surprised to see that a business and the EA is like the household, broadly defined, are fiscally and spatially contiguous. Okay, this is where you see people have businesses in the home. Please don't think about businesses in the home necessarily just as, you know, I assemble toothpicks in a box or something in my home as some sort of putting out or some sort of, you know, this kind of labor. You know, I have women's businesses where their home is one room inside of a huge factory. Okay? Not just you have a house with a little restaurant on the side. It can be the inverse, right? Where the capital is invested in the plant, in which case the household living space is tiny. You can have both of those things going on, but only working class people, okay? People with a working class background, let's say, okay? So, what are the institutional hurdles to working class women entrepreneurs? The 1890s Meiji Civil Code, if I were to think about one piece of law or legislation or one sort of emergent or development that emerges in Japan that has the most significant impact on history or the tradition, so to speak, of entrepreneurship among women, it's this law which standardized for the entire country something that had never been standard. It standardized patrolocality. It standardized single heir inheritance. In Japan, there had never been uniform single heir inheritance. Never. Single heir inheritance occurred for the most part only in the samurai class and also among the aristocrats at the imperial court. Single heir inheritance only there. Right now, a range of different kinds of marital systems and inheritance systems in different, by region and by class. Okay? 1890 says there's only going to be one. It's going to be the one that had been the samurai class. Okay? And in this one fell swoop, you know, there are ranges of women who no longer could own property. Right? That's very serious. Or who could no longer inherit property. In spite of the fact that they may have belonged in families or regions where women regularly inherited property, or women regularly were integral to, say, merchant business life. Okay, so 1890s Meiji Civil Code, this caused a huge headache, and also was not reversed until, as we say, the occupation. Institutional hurdles to working class gender norms is the idea of good wives and wise mothers. which means that if you are of a class or in an economic circumstance where you cannot achieve being a full housewife, a full-time homemaker, this puts on you some sort of internal psychic stress, right? That this is what a woman is supposed to be, but somehow something's wrong with me. I'm not, I can't, I don't. All right? So there's a pressure among some working women to desire no longer to be an entrepreneur or to own businesses or be part of the family business. The desire is to become a housewife, which has a kind of a romance, a kind of patina on it of like, I can stay home and be with my children and I can drink tea, or actually, not even in a negative sense, right? I've read a historical record where women moan, or they lament, with reasonable lament, that they had to tie their children to the pillars of the house to keep them from falling in the fire pit, so that they had to go work and harvest rice. And from that perspective, you know, being a liberated woman is not the right to go work, it's the right to sit down. It's the right to raise your children, right? So among these working class women, as this idea that women should be full-time housewives, you have among them like a desire, increasing, to do that thing, and not to have to work all day, every day, with all this kind of thing. So the middle-class gender norm, you should think about it as a kind of a hurdle to working-class women entrepreneurs. Now here's another hurdle. Now, among the middle class, I put this as something that helps women entrepreneurs, right? But equal inheritance law, inheritance and taxation also hurts because people can't afford to hold on to any of their property. If the property is very, very small and it gets divided among heirs equally, it's not enough property to do anything with, right? Or if the taxation on it is so high that you can't hold it, you have to get rid of it. A business that you used to have that had a space, you no longer have. Okay, so it can cut both ways, the equal heir inheritance law and the problem of inheritance taxation. Oh, maybe I should have put this in a different place. How much time do I have?
You've got about 7 minutes.
All right, let's see, I might skip number 4. No, I'm going to talk about number 4 because the discourses of modernity in Japan postulate that a modern Japan is one in which industrial capitalism is primary, in which, how can I say, industrial capitalism, venture capitalism, certain kinds of businesses constitute modernity, okay? And if you are part of a business or a business system, for example, if you own a business that is contiguous with the home, if you have a small business, if you're an SME, if you're part of a business world that does not meet that standard, the resultant invisibility makes it impossible for you to access resources or state resources. Okay? So invisibility, value, access to state programs, the idea of modernity, a Japanese national identity that privileges certain kinds of businesses, disempowers other types of businesses. Okay? And women are largely represented in those disempowered businesses. Okay? Not just women, okay? Because we're talking about working class people, not just women's businesses. So this is also associated with, I can say Koreans living in Japan. It's also associated, it's women in Japan. Do you guys know the expression burakumin, or how do you say, untouchable people, right? So there's a range of businesses that are invisible because, or they're invisible and therefore are, the people who engage in them are people who are largely disempowered or disenfranchised, or otherwise there are barriers to their engaging in other forms of economic activity, such as being hired and receiving wage labor. Now, instead of talking about solutions to these, I want to talk about the notion of stability. Okay? Because in the face of these kinds of structural impediments, these working class people's businesses still have a certain degree of flexibility in the way of managing, dealing with these kinds of things in a process that preserves the kind of, I don't know, traditional business forms, or maybe in some way you should say the traditional business forms are part of what's supporting and continuing these kinds of businesses. The idea of fiscal and spatial home business contiguity is a great survival technique. It's a great survival technique because it solves, and this has already been observed, it solves the problem of women having to satisfy the dominant norm of being a mother and being economically productive. Right? This is where you go to a butcher shop and, the person has their baby and they're working, or you go to, the flower retailer and you see the person's kid running in at the end of the day after school to Daima, and you give them your milk and cookie essentially and keep on working. Okay, so fiscal and spatial home contiguity solves some of this pressure that women would otherwise experience, or they do experience it. Okay, another kind of structure that is extremely long-lasting is conjugal partnerships. The idea that a husband and wife can work simultaneously, and in that simultaneity be able to support, maintain a family kind of value. Okay, raising children together, sharing risks together, making decisions together. Here's another one. Mukoyoshi is a style of marriage that predates the 1890s Meiji Civil Code. Mukoyoshi is a marriage pattern where businesses are passed matrilineally, and it's actually specific to certain industries. There's a range of industries that are moved from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law to daughter. It stays inside the matrilineal line, and they do that by marrying somebody from outside the family and adopting that person into the female family. Okay, so that, the man who's married into the family comes into a new family rather than it being patrilocal, that is, a woman marries and joins another family. So a man will take his wife's family's name. It's inverse, okay? That still functions today, right? Especially in the traditional inn industry. This mostly functions in, you actually saw this in merchant households quite a lot, in the Tokugawa period and in the Meiji period. Merchant households do this to keep the family business in one place. Okay, so that still continues, especially in the traditional inn business, ryokan, traditional inns. Okay, so you still see this despite these other pressures of what it means to be modern. Yeah, 2 minutes. Let's see how much more. Actually, I think this is about all I have. Very close. The household system that we're talking about is able to, in some ways, stabilize their larger small businesses, small and medium-sized industries by engaging in limited corporations, not full corporations, limited corporations, where the shareholders are actual members of the family. Not such a surprise. Let me not talk about subcontracting. We don't have time. Let me just make a little tiny comment about point 7, petty and peripatetic business. One of the things happens with people who have restaurants that were tied to family property, who lose that property because of equal heir inheritance, is they move their restaurants into a peripatetic style of restaurant business. So if you see someone wheeling or a little cart down the road, or if you see someone with a van, in the back of the van there's a little kitchen unit, and they're selling takoyaki or some sort of food that you can buy down the street, walking down the street and eat. Lots of times these are people who had a business, lost the family land, and then moved the business into a peripatetic form. So you'll still see that going on. And peripatetic merchanting is something that's very, very ancient, where people can, sell tea, carrying it around and things like that. So this is something that you'll still see in Japan, though of course I think it's becoming less and less common. All right. The only thing I'm going to say in conclusion is that this is a false bifurcation between middle-class women's businesses and working-class women's businesses. These things, in action, which I've done for simplification's sake, these things are actually very much layered on top of each other and among each other. Okay, and that adds a layer of complexity to understanding the dynamics that are running in 20th century entrepreneurship among women. That I certainly could not have explicated here in under 30 minutes. But, okay.
Thank you. Questions? Just time for maybe one.
Sorry, question.
Karen.
I am interested. I just was wondering about, I have more than one question, but I was curious about the subcontracting and freelance businesses and how that fits in.
Right. I consider freelance businesses to be a point of contiguity with subcontracting. We tend to think of subcontracting, we tend to think of somebody making computer parts or some sort of complicated high technology thing that's tied to Toshiba or some big company. But you'll find that women who go to two-year colleges in the 1960s, 1970s, you get more and more women going to university, coming out with skill sets that they use to subcontract. But the subcontracting does not require a factory. So you have perspective illustrators, right? You have people who are able to do copy editing, all kinds of service-style, knowledge-based skills, okay? That is more profitable, more flexible than working as an pink-collar office worker who's expected to go home after she gets married and gets talked to like she's stupid, after she's been to school and is an intelligent, educated woman. So you see that exploding in the 1970s, women doing more and more. And it's funny because people tend not to think about that as entrepreneurial, but these are women who have to go and sell themselves to different clients. These are people who are often in a position of weakness vis-a-vis their clients. Very similar to what happens with subcontracting, right? So you have a number of clients, or even one or two clients only, okay, and your relationship with them becomes somewhat fixed and permanent, and it's very hard to move elsewhere. Also, high competition among those people. So that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Is there a concept of like disguised employment, or in the sense of the freelance? Because we see this in Canada, we have a notion of it's termed as self-employment, but really by legal tests for Revenue Canada, it's actually an employment situation. The employer owns the tools. They set,
right,
and they maybe have one client or two clients.
Not among the women I interviewed, but that's a self-selection thing, all right? I suspect that is the case. I actually know of some large, like a woman who owns a very large factory for pachinko. Do you know pachinko? What is it, like pinball gambling? So her business makes components for that, but the company that she's assembling those parts for owns the assembly equipment that's on her family property. When they do equipment upgrades, then they deliver that material to her, and that's a kind of situation like what you were talking about. But it's not a freelance kind of thing. This is somebody who's owning a factory that's been built by somebody else on her family property. So it does exist, but not just in this kind of liminal space of individual women trying to find someone to copy edit their work.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Christienne, thank you very much.